In 1913, a St. Louis housewife named Pearl Curran sat down at a Ouija board and claimed to make contact with a spirit called Patience Worth, a 17th-century Englishwoman who spoke in an archaic language and spun tales with uncanny speed. What began as a parlor amusement soon erupted into a literary mystery. Novels, poems and dialogues flowed effortlessly through Pearl, though she had no known training in such artistry. Was this the voice of a forgotten soul, the hidden genius of an unlikely medium, or just a big hoax, either for profit or simply to kill boredom? This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 9, Episode 13. I'm host Ben, as always, and back this week with a story of... I thought we'd lighten the mood a little in preparation for an intensely dark episode next week. So I thought we'd dig into a little bit of spiritualism. I haven't done that for a little while. So there's no news, so we can jump straight into it. This episode is called The Literary Miracles of Patience Worth. The practice of automatic writing, the psychic ability of channeling words, phrases, passages and texts from an unseen being onto a blank page via a writing instrument or Ouija board, has been a central practice within the occult arts for well over 1,000 years. The early concept of Fuji throughout China in the 10th century is one of the earliest examples, whereby a suspended tray would be filled with sand or incense ash, allowing characters to be drawn and erased into the movable material via a wooden or metal stylus. This was all overseen by Taoist priests who were said to have been in direct mediumist contact with archaic deities or ancestral spirits. As each character would be written, then read aloud by the priest, a transcription would be made and the sand would be wiped smooth, and the process would be repeated until an entire message was completed. Oftentimes, these messages were matters of spiritual guidance, but they were also used for more down-to-earth matters and personal requests where an individual might have been seeking answers to questions on moral guidance, spiritual healing, and even the settling of societal conflicts. In Europe, spirit writing, whilst not quite so old, can still be dated back more than 400 years to the 16th century, when John Dee, an English mathematician, astrologer and occultist, and his psychic assistant Edward Kelly believed they were receiving messages from angels. Dee, utilising Kelly's psychic scrying abilities, was presented with a new angelic language consisting of 21 letters, which then expanded to a full text. The language, which he named Enochian, became the basis for Dee's Enochian school of magic, whose primary purpose was to invoke the presence of angels and spirit deities in order that their supposed energies and wisdom be harnessed and utilised for practical purposes, including the discovery of the elixir of life. All told, it was all a rather esoteric and complicated jumble of ideas that, unsurprisingly, caught the attention of Aleister Crowley in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn hundreds of years later. Despite these examples dating back centuries, it wasn't until the 19th century, with the explosion of spiritualism, that automatic writing really moved away from the higher arts and hit the mainstream public. Finally, out of the hands of specialist priests or eccentric and incomprehensible academics, the practice saw a golden period that lasted several decades, as mediums sat at seance tables, pencil in hand, and called forth the spirits from the other side to take control of the medium's hand and scrawl on sheets of empty paper in order to convey messages to the great thrill of the paying onlookers. Whilst many amongst the thriving 19th century spiritualist movement believed the practice to be a gateway to the spiritual realm, by the turn of the century, more scientific members of the psychological community began considering the practice to be more of a gateway to an equally mystical area of the mind that was coming to be known as the subconscious, popularised by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. At the same time, artists were tapping into a similar practice, using what they described as automatic painting, hoping to bypass the conscious mind that inherently blocked raw creative energy. Naturally, the resulting works were a big hit with the surrealist schools, which, coincidentally, were also beginning to take off at the same time. With the practice in the hands of the layman, and everyone from psychic mediums to artists, writers and psychologists dabbling in the concept, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw a huge deluge of work come into creation, all originating from a mystical, unseen world. Unfortunately, almost all of it was either completely unintelligible or with questionable artistic merit. At times, however, the subconscious, or the spirits, depending on the beliefs of the automatic writing practitioner, would come up with something truly remarkable. And in 1915, in a bustling city in Missouri, America, a young housewife struck on something just so, when she began channeling the voice of a 17th-century English peasant with a penchant for literature. Born on the 15th of April, 1883, in Mound City, Illinois, Pearl Curran was the only child of George and Mary Pollard, a popular and successful couple who had made their comfortable position through business and the arts. Pearl's father, George, a one-time amateur artist, had long since forgotten his passions with the paintbrush and had been heavily involved with a career in the railways and the local lead business, whilst her mother, though known as somewhat nervous, had been a keen singer with a passion for writing, though, just like George, she had benched any serious ambitions following her marriage, as homely duties took the front seat in her life. Shortly after the birth of Pearl, the family moved to Fort Worth in Texas, which is where Pearl grew up as a curious child, collecting bits of broken glass and china and dressing her cats in doll's clothes. A quiet child, she had few friends, but was happy and healthy in her own world, towing the family dog around in a small doll cart. She played music, but took little interest in formal lessons, developing a characteristic she took into her school life, which she quickly became disinterested in, though she somehow, quite against her own understanding, managed to graduate into high school. There she continued at the request of her mother and scraped through thanks to the help of her father, who she enlisted as her homework tutor. By the age of 13, the heavy burden of schoolwork grew to be too much for Pearl, who described herself at the time as sickly, having suffered measles, mumps, chickenpox, and a developing congenital problem with her eyesight. And as such, she broke down and was sent to a Catholic academy for rest. Following her bout of recuperation, the family moved to St. Louis, in Missouri, where Pearl seemed to thrive, finally developing an interest in her music lessons and generally growing into a relatively privileged education. Unfortunately, her parents were not coping quite as well. The move to St. Louis had come on the back of financial ruin for her father, and now the family were living with Pearl's aunt and grandmother in the hopes of getting back on their feet. This didn't take too long, and soon George was back in the world of business, prospecting his way through the world of lead mines. But for Pearl, she found her world shrinking and growing dull, and her lack of ongoing education stifled her curiosity. Luckily, she was able to secure a recommendation for a singing school in Chicago, and she moved away from her family, taking a job addressing envelopes at the McKinley Music Company in order to pay for lessons, whilst her father, who was now working his way back to middle-class comforts, paid for her board. For a period, she played piano at her uncle's spiritualist church in Chicago, but finding the clientele to be a little on the odd side, she stepped back from that after only 6 weeks, stating that she found the whole spiritualist thing to be repulsive. Over the following years, she alternated singing lessons in Chicago with teaching music in Missouri until 1907, shortly after she had turned 24, when she met and married John H. Curran, a divorcee 15 years her senior, with a young 6-year-old daughter from his previous marriage. At one time, John Curran had been the immigration commissioner for Missouri, and the marriage saw Pearl once again find herself living in very middle-class comforts. The new family moved to St. Louis and settled down in a 2-story red brick house with a wide porch near the city parks, where, just like her mother, Pearl placed her earlier dreams of becoming a famous singer onto the back burner in order that she could focus on her role as mother to her new daughter-in-law and wife to her new husband, as expected of any proper early 20th century lady, though John did at least encourage her to continue with her music lessons. For the most part, though, Pearl found her time occupied by housework, and in the evenings she would sing for the family or visit the picture theatre. Her life was essentially a quiet, ordinary life in a quiet, ordinary Midwestern family. It was undoubtedly comfortable, but just like the days before her move to Chicago, it was somewhat dull and boring. That was until 1913, and the peculiar appearance of Patience Worth. It was the summer of 1912, 5 years after her marriage to John Curran, when Pearl was introduced to a Ouija board. John was partial to a game of cards or two with his friends, and in those long evenings, the wives of the players were left to entertain themselves, away from the vices exclusive to the men of the era, of alcohol, cigars and gambling. For Pearl, this meant spending time with one of her neighbours, Emily Hutchins, whose husband was a colleague of John's. Emily had recently lost her mother and had been keen to attempt to contact her via the medium of a Ouija board that she'd been shown by another friend. And together with Pearl, the two dabbled with the planchette in the back room of Pearl's house, whiling away the hours, all for a spot of fun. Unsurprisingly to Pearl, who had always had a sceptical and fairly negative view of the spiritualists that she had met throughout her uncle, nothing seemed to happen. And shortly after, when Pearl had lost her own father, Pearl decided to give the whole thing a wide berth. Emily, on the other hand, only found her resolve to contact one of the recently deceased, continuing to grow with every wasted hour. Doubling down, she insisted to Pearl that they should keep the Ouija sessions going. Emily's perseverance was seemingly rewarded shortly after when a series of gibberish words were spelled out by the board, though, to Pearl, the nonsense was nothing but a garbled mess. This further spurred Emily on, and she dragged Pearl along with her, much against Pearl's own interests. Then, after almost a year of failed sessions and trying to translate a few lines of random letters, on the evening of the 22nd of June, 1913, just as John was busy gambling in the front room, the planchette began moving, and this time it was moving with some purpose. As it slid around the board, it spelled out the letters P-A-T-C, P-A-T-C, over and over. The word meant nothing to Pearl, and looking over to Emily and judging by the look on her face, it meant very little to her friend also. But there could be no mistaking that the planchette was spelling the same 4 letters again and again, and with some determination. Calling in their husbands, John had everyone going for a short while when he pretended that he had a recently deceased friend named Pat Macmillan. But he couldn't keep the joke running for long, and brief excitement soon dissipated when he admitted that the name meant absolutely nothing to him, just like everyone else in the room. Still, the incident had only excited Emily, and even Pearl had to admit that she was starting to find more than a casual interest in the board. And so, the two, along with Pearl's mother, who acted as a note-taker, sitting at the table with pencil and paper in hand, continued to work the planchette in the hopes that Pat, if that really was a name, might return. It was just over 2 weeks when the planchette moved again. This time, however, it really did move with a purpose, and as Pearl spelled out the letters one by one, her mother wrote them down. The graphite of her pencil skidded across the paper as quickly as the planchette could move across the board. After a few moments, the 3 women sat back, eyes wide to take in the message that the board had given them. Oh, why let sorrow steal thy heart? Thy bosom is but its foster mother, the world its cradle, and the loving home its grave. And with that, whatever it was that was communicating with them concluded their speech, and the planchette sat unmoving once more. Excited by everything that they'd just witnessed, the women called in their husbands and told the story, this time to much less joking. Instead, John suggested the women continue, but insisted that they kept a minute-by-minute written record of events. This was a job which Pearl's mother was happy to take on, at the same time agreeing to take notes home after each session to write them up into legible sentences. The Ouija board had no way to dictate punctuation, after all, and so despite the words being spelled being clearly legible, the meanings were not always quite as clear as they could be at first glance. Later that night, after the men had returned to their card games, the women tried once more to contact their ghostly visitor, and this time it replied with quite some flair, dictating a few lines of speech, this time with a more poetic fluidity. Rest, weary heart, let only sunshine light the shrine within. A single ray shall filter through and warm thy frozen soul. A leaf falls and nestles close to the earth, but oh, the message she once sent to spring. So 'tis with thee, then nestle close on thy last day, but leave a message like the leaf to come again in spring. Touch, taste and smell are homely facts, but thy heartbeats are a record for him. Your deeds are nothing, only the heart prompts what the circumstances will not permit. Looking at the paper, no one was really sure what it all meant, but there was no denying that it was saying something. Finally, it appeared that the 3 women had cracked the Ouija board, and they seemed to have hooked a genuine spirit. The whole evening had both excited Pearl, but also quite disturbed her in equal measure. Still unsure of spiritualism and all its strange ways, she decided to steer away from the board for several days, unsure as to how to proceed, and unsure if she even really wanted to. Eventually, however, curiosity and the enthusiasm of Emily got the better of her, and once more the three women were back at it, Ouija board rested on their knees and fingers on the planchette, calling out to their spiritual acquaintance to see if she might fancy a brief return. Within moments, the letters came, one after another, until more relatively confusing and quite floral prose came forward again. With the excitement returning, the women began again with their questions, asking who the writer was. Just as quickly as before, the planchette moved, giving an answer that would soon become characteristically vague and frustratingly cryptic. Should one so near be confined to a name? The sun shines alike on the briar and the rose. Do they make question of a name? Perhaps the mystery writer was right, but it didn't stop the curiosity, and everyone at the board felt a straight answer might have been nice. Instead, the mystery kept them returning, and for several nights the spirit returned on prompt, spelling out several further lines of poetic garble, before finally, on the night of the 8th of July, the mystery spirit delivered something more tangible. Many moons ago I lived, again I come. Patience Worth my name. Speechless, everyone sat in silence, and then the planchette moved once more. Wait, I would speak with thee. If thou shalt live, then so shall I. I make my bread by the hearth. Good friends, let us be merry. The time for work is past. Let the tabby drowse, and blink her wisdom to the firelog. Excited as they were confused, the women all continued to stare, before Pearl admitted that Patience Worth seemed a strange name, and questioned when she had lived. The answer came less clear, a spattering of numbers, 1649, and then another, some time later, 9 and a 4. Concluding that this must surely have meant either the year 1649 or 1694, the group began batting around a few theories. Perhaps Patience Worth was the spirit of a long-dead Quaker woman from the 17th century. Unfortunately, Patience herself was not giving up any more answers, instead choosing to be both cryptic and aloof. When asked where she had lived, she said only across the sea, later confirming that she had actually lived in Dorset, England, though she called it Dorsetshire for seemingly unknown reasons. For the most part, however, when follow-up questions were asked, she gave little away. About me you would know much, the board spelled at one point. Yesterday is dead, let thy mind rest as to the past. The unseen Patience would frequently then go on to berate Pearl for asking too many questions. On this occasion, taking the hint that the spirit, if indeed that's what it was, seemingly had no interest in continuing the conversation about her life in the mortal world, Pearl instead changed tact and decided to politely ask her if she would like to continue. Apparently, not too upset by the women's questioning, Patience gave one last reply for the evening. If the storm passes, thanks, good souls. Could I but hold your ear for the lessons I would teach, a striving for truth will not avail thee. All told, it had been a rather exciting evening of spirit communication. They finally had a name, Patience Worth, who apparently had lived in England during the 17th century. Unfortunately, nobody had any clue as to who Patience Worth actually was. She was no known relative of anyone in the room at least, and she was certainly nobody of any notable fame. Still, it had all been rather exciting, and the women endeavoured to find out as much as they could about their spirit visitor in further sessions. In fact, Pearl, who had not been especially keen on the Ouija board games until now, had rather turned a corner, and instead she now began to see a new flicker of excitement that her life had sorely been missing since her marriage to John. A week later, Pearl, Emily and Pearl's mother were back, asking Patience for her words of wisdom once more, which, naturally, she was keen to provide, this time in a series of epigrams. Professing piety can heal too foul a conscience as surely as a sunny summer saves the wheat when rain is shy. Shadows to the weary are a cooling balm, but as youth basks in the sun, so at twilight come shade and rest. Cradle thy heart in love, cloak thy deeds in pity, strengthen thy soul with long draughts of wisdom, culled from the vine of truthful knowledge, and go forth a warrior indeed. Put faith in meagre efforts, and I promise ye much. Over the following weeks, throughout July and August, the three women continued their probing of Patience, hoping to find out more about her life, who she was, and also of some interest, who or what she was now. No steady answers were ever forthcoming, but the spirit did continue to reply, in what was clearly becoming a consistent style. Patience's speech was always floral, archaic in many respects, but never completely unintelligible to the modern ear. It used simple words, but pieced them together in poetic ways, and was frequently tinged with religious elements. Whenever anyone asked too many personal questions of Patience, she would reply with an almost acerbic wit, frequently cutting down those who would push her too far. She did, however, give up small pieces of information here and there. Firstly, confirming that the year of her life had been 1649, not 1694, and that she had moved to America at the age of 35. Secondly, she gave a few hints as to the workings of her communications, stating that she was using Pearl as some kind of spiritualist medium, though she did put this in somewhat less attractive terms, calling Pearl a pot that Patience was using to brew a potion. When asked her current age, she said only, "'Tis odd, I forget it." By the autumn of 2013, the sessions with Patience had increased to 2 or even 3 sessions a week, and new members had begun joining them from time to time, all coming from the local neighbourhood, keen to see for themselves the subject of so many quiet rumours that had begun to circulate. Emily, who had a background in journalism and writing for several major newspapers, had also begun to float the idea, both with Pearl and Patience herself, of writing a book chronicling their communications. This suggestion was met with no objections from either party, and in fact seemed to quite excite Patience, who was more than happy to spread her pearls of wisdom far and wide. In preparation for unleashing Patience to a wider audience, Pearl and Emily also began inviting more and more people to sit with them whilst they were carrying on with their Ouija board sessions, growing a small circle of followers who all seemed to be just as fascinated with Patience as they had been. This was a good sign for Emily's up-and-coming publication. One other experiment that the women tried was to take the Ouija board outside of Pearl's house to see if Patience would still be contactable, no matter their location. Until now, they had always been in the back parlour of Pearl's home, so no one was quite sure how the spirit would react to being called elsewhere. But thankfully, location seemed to be something of a moot point to the voices of the undead, and Patience was just as verbose outside the house as she was within. This allowed them to widen the circle even further, which had another interesting benefit in that it gave Patience something of a workout, in the sense that the more people that would visit, the more diverse the questions became. And this paid dividends in December of 1913, when Patience was asked by one of the visitors what Pearl had bought her for Christmas. And Patience's reply seemed to show some form of psychic ability. She had been quick with her reply. 15 pieces and 1 cracked, she spelled confidently, much to Pearl's great surprise. She had actually bought her friend a set of 15 kitchen jars, and one, upon delivery, had been received broken. But this was a fact that was only known to Pearl and no one else. The friend kept asking questions, next asking Patience if she knew what the friend had bought for Pearl in return. Once again, Patience replied quickly. Table store, cross-stitched, nay, then stitched across. As it turned out, the friend had bought Pearl some table linen, and just like before, this had been a fact that nobody else in the room had been aware of. As the new year got underway, Patience continued to progress, and by February she had evolved her floral prose into writing straight poetry, and as it turned out, she was seemingly quite prolific. The first hint that Patience had any literary ability came in the February of 1914, when she dictated a poem conjured on the spot. The piece was left untitled by Patience, but Pearl would later call it the Farewell Song. Heed I the sighting of my soul, for truth am I a mighty tempest, breaking all barriers and laying low the forest, distrust where lingers mine undoing, or but the night breeze gently blowing, and only piling leaves as mine own barrier. Ah, for my last rest and farewell song, to this my stalk let me rest upon twigs of mine own breaking, lulled by the soughing of the echo of my last tempest. Wrap me then in sweet herbs of deeds well done, that like the rose of seasons gone breathes back a scent and smile of yesteryear. Pillow not my head upon my good intent, for rest would surely flee, a stone would better be. Ah, peaceful vale, wherein my soul may be my soul and call not, as the night bird his mate, who but re-echoes his song. Nay, as cold stars warm the heavens to light, so must coldly cold truth warm my soul, and I shall sow myself not a fanged or painted thing, not yet the gentle smiling, oily thing I could crave the world to believe. Strike ye the sword or dip ye in an inken well, smear ye a gaudy colour or daub ye the clay. Ay, beat upon the bosom then and cry, 'tis mine, this world, love, and yen glory. Ah, master hand, who guided thee, stay, dost thou know that through the ages, ye through the very ages, one grain of hero dust blown from afar hath lodged and moveth thee? Wait, wreath thyself and wait, the green shall deepen to an ashen brown, and crumble then and fall into thy sightless eyes, while the mouldering flesh droppeth away. Wait and catch thy dust, mayhap thou canst build it back. Our world, our folly, thou art king of her. She will not, but is unlike unto the monk, who prays within his cell, unheedful of the timid sunbeams who would light the page his wisdom so befogs. Surprised and excited by this new revelation, the women transcribed the verse and quickly considered what they should do with it. Emily, of course, was keen to place it in the book that she had planned to write on Patience, but unfortunately, the relationship between herself and Pearl had grown quite tense in recent weeks, with some friction growing between the two after Patience had confirmed that Pearl was the key to the spiritual communications, leaving Pearl and her mother to question the importance of Emily's presence at all. Soon after the first poem was dictated by Patience, Pearl began sitting at the Ouija board without Emily there, drafting in her husband John to take her place instead. When Patience trotted out a brand new poem on their first session without Emily, Pearl felt sure that Emily was no longer needed, and quite quickly began phasing her out of the picture. Gradually, as more visitors came to see the sessions, Pearl began inviting them to sit at the Ouija board rather than Emily, who found herself more of a watcher than a participator. As the year grew on and summer ascended upon St. Louis, signalling a year of Patience communications, she dictated what would go on to be one of her most famous poems that Pearl would eventually name Patient God. Ah, God, I have drunken to the dregs and flung the cup at thee. The dust of crumbled righteousness hath dried and soaked into itself. E'en the drop I spilled to Bacchus, whilst thou, all patient, sendest purple vintage for a later harvest. Shorter than some of her earlier pieces, it nevertheless arrived with Pearl and her onlookers with some excitement, mostly due to the religious elements which Pearl believed helped to demonstrate Patience's overarching philosophies on life, which were beginning to solidify. At the same time, though, Patience was constantly evolving and tossing up new ways to surprise her audience. In autumn of that year, shortly after Pearl and her husband had moved house, Patience began dictating what would be the first of her longer works. It was a play set in a medieval setting, focusing on the life of a hunchback with a pet monkey named Beppo, who had fallen hopelessly in love with a lady named Lisa. In an effort to win her hand in marriage, the hunchback entered a jousting competition, only to be killed by a rival knight. It was quite a departure from her earlier poetry, but the writing would prove to be no less floral in its delivery. The whole story was diligently scribbled upon paper by Pearl's mother, as Pearl spelled out each word, letter by letter, over twice-weekly sessions lasting for several months. Unsurprisingly, word soon got around Pearl's new neighbourhood that she was communicating with a 17th-century English spirit with a talent for literature, and the circle of visitors continued to grow, eventually even captivating some of the local St. Louisian royalty. Casper Yost was a publicist, writer and editor of the St. Louis Globe-Democrat newspaper, and he had heard all about Patience Worth and her blossoming tale of medieval drama, and soon wound up as one of Pearl's more illustrious regular guests. Deeply religious, Yost had been captivated by Patience's more God-focused writings, and he wanted to introduce Patience to the wider world through his Sunday editorial. After introducing himself and his wife to Pearl, he quickly asked to pore over the huge stack of paper that was beginning to form a grand archive of Patience Worth, and then he floated the idea of writing her story. Just as Emily had been elbowed to the side, Yost swept in right on time to pick up the story anew. On Tuesday, the 2nd of February 1915, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat published a teaser advertisement for Yost's upcoming series of articles on what it called perhaps the most miraculous physical phenomena the world has ever known. That Sunday, the 7th of February, the paper printed the first of a 5-part, full-page editorial detailing the story of Pearl Curran and Patience Worth, whose names were replaced with the pseudonyms Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith. The piece was headlined The Mystery of Patience Worth, and it was stuffed absolutely full of superlatives, praising the profound intellect of Patience and the keen, swift, subtle and profound nature of her poetry. The piece printed several of Patience's poems and promoted the honesty of Pearl, who it stated was above suspicion and charlatanism. The editorial caused quite a stir throughout St. Louis, making great sales for the paper and bringing unrivalled interest in the mysterious Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Smith, who everyone talked about for weeks, trying to uncover the identity of this most fantastic medium. Each new week's article came with fresh poetry, excerpts from Patience's longer works, and more hyperbole than one could stomach on a Sunday morning over breakfast. This fueled massive amounts of gossip and, of course, the sales for the newspaper. Finally, on the 5th week, the identity of Pearl Curran was divulged, along with an almost quarter-page headshot of the enigmatic medium. Patience's real name was also given, and a little more speculation was given on her background, with Yost suggesting that she was most likely the spirit of a Puritan or Quaker. This series of articles had been a huge success, at least commercially, for Yost, and it had also been incredibly successful publicly for Pearl and Patience, who had seen interest in their sessions explode. Yost, buoyed by the paper's sales, immediately approached Pearl and suggested converting his articles from the paper into a full-fledged book on the case of Patience Worth, which Pearl, and perhaps more importantly Patience, was more than happy to agree to. With all this public exposure, it wasn't long before word of the Patience case was reaching far outside of St. Louis, and to more literary men than Yost. William Reedy was another newspaper writer, but unlike Yost, Reedy's Mirror, his weekly magazine, had an international circulation that catered to some of the more critical intellectuals across the globe. Reedy himself was something of an eccentric and undoubtedly a self-important literary critic who had sat on the judging panel for the first Pulitzer Prize in poetry. His magazine was highly respected, as was his opinion on literary matters. So, when Pearl heard from Reedy himself, who was interested in coming to speak with Patience after reading some of her poetry that had been printed in Yost's article, it seemed to all involved that Patience was on the precipice of making it. In truth, with Reedy's critical eye falling over Patience's verse, Pearl could well have had every right to fear the sessions with Reedy present. However, Reedy had already published an article on what he called Patience's necromantic poetry, and she had already known that he had spoken about the whole case in fairly sceptical but overall very positive tones. Reedy had made sure to point out that he held absolutely no stock in spiritualism, nor the belief of the afterlife, but he did suggest that Patience's poetry was good enough to require further study. And so, when he contacted the Currans, it all seemed to be a good fit. That September, John visited William Reedy and handed over a selection of Patience's poems, and then, a week later, Reedy joined Pearl and John at their home to witness the communications with Patience for himself. Still erring on the side of the skeptic, Reedy stepped into the St. Louis backroom with more than a little cynicism, ready to discover a hoax or call out a fraud. When Patience began to move the planchette and Pearl invited him to ask questions, Reedy was also quite happy to ask some very difficult questions, including who she thought wrote the plays of Shakespeare and other historical and literary questions pertaining to the late 17th century. As expected, Patience gave her usual evasive answers, speaking much but saying little, which Reedy was quick to remark upon, saying that Patience was keen to give plenty of replies but no answers. Still, whatever he had seen on his first visit clearly impressed him enough to return, and a week later he brought his wife along to enjoy the spectacle too. Once again, he posed several difficult questions, mostly pertaining to religion and the existence of God, As before, Patience gave many long-winded replies, all as vague as ever, but at least she was doing so in a kindly manner, reserving her usually quite scathing tongue. It seemed clear that, despite his tough and sceptically driven questions, Patience had taken a liking to Reedy. Finally, after another perplexing session, Reedy left and got to work on his own article for the Mirror, which he published on Sunday the 1st of October, headlined, "My Flirtation with Patience Worth." In the article, Reedy reiterated his lack of belief in spirits, but at the same time said that he at least believed in Patience Worth. He just wasn't quite sure what Patience Worth actually was. Her writing, he said, was not quite as good as Shakespeare, but certainly better than the fiction cooked up for most national magazines. And overall, he said it was wonderful in content and form. As far as fakery was concerned, it seemed the 2 sessions that he had witnessed were enough to convince him otherwise. Now, Mrs. Curran is an educated woman, but not overwhelmingly so. She has read the usual novels, the usual poems that an educated woman reads, but she is not familiar with early English literature. She is no philologist. She is simply a woman of agreeable intelligence, not at all, as we would say, a high brow. She knows nothing of the roots of language, yet she has spelled out on the Ouija board many hundreds of thousands of words in an English most primitive, with no Norman, Italian, Latin, Spanish, Danish or other origins. Mrs. Curran is a musician and singer, but I doubt if she knows the dialect of the earliest known English song that has come down to us, "Summer is a-comin' in." She doesn't know Langland or Chaucer. She's read Shakespeare, of course, and the Bible, but she is not soaked in early English, or, indeed, in later English literature. Often, indeed, she cannot understand the argot, let us call it, of the questions put to the personality whose letter-by-letter dictation she spells out. And sometimes, while she reads off the words of Patience Worth's answers, she knows the words all right, but the ideas conveyed by them utterly escape her. A week later, Reedy published one of Patience's poems in full, complete with his own critique, where he suggested that, if Patience Worth be an invention, the inventor is a genius of no mean order. Overall, it was more than positive in tone, and was all set to launch Patience Worth onto an international world of literary interest, unlike anything Pearl and John Curran could possibly have imagined. And it was also to reach far wider than Casper Yost could possibly have dreamed of when he first suggested writing his book. It hardly stopped there either. For over 12 weeks, Reedy published articles on Patience, alongside printing dozens of letters from his reading audience, all academics and intellectuals, that seemed to all find a distinct mark of quality in Patience's writings. Many of these visited Pearl over the coming months to see the sessions for themselves, including John Livingston Lowes, the professor of English at Washington University. Like Reedy before him, Lowes entered into the room with a sceptical eye, and when permitted, he put several difficult questions to Patience, mostly pertaining to the use of her fairly unique flavour of Old English, which he believed seemed not to fit any one time period. Patience apparently took umbrage with such questions, and rather than give any answers, she simply snapped at him, and when he asked how she planned her messages, she replied simply, "Doth the spider think of a web?" As unsatisfying an answer as this may have seemed to the professor, the sessions must have been intriguing enough, as he continued to return for several weeks afterwards. One of his more interesting attempts at an experiment came when he attempted to use Patience's own speech pattern to communicate with her, which seemed to only confuse the alleged spirit. By now, Patience's fame was exploding, and Patience was showing no signs of slowing down. Having already completed 2 full-length plays and countless poems, she signalled to Pearl that she would soon begin her 3rd long-form story. Once again, this would be set in medieval England. Patience spat out thousands of words at a time, completing the whole thing over multiple sessions, totalling 6 acts and more than 20,000 words. These long-form pieces did allow for the more academic-minded of the audience to witness large amounts of Patience's unique language to be read in a more contextualised setting, which gave them far more opportunity to pick apart the etymological origins of her speech. As many had suspected and briefly commented on before, it appeared that Patience was using some kind of amalgamated language, stemming from quite a vast time period and quite a large geographical area of England, with a highly unusual percentage of Anglo-Saxon Old English for its alleged time. When asked about this specifically, Patience actually confirmed the same thing, saying that her speech was mostly wits of this and that from here and there, but she gave no more indication as to how or why she had came upon such a style. Meanwhile, whilst Patience was being put through her paces by the academics, Casper Yost was busy finishing up his book on Patience Worth, which was finally set to be published by the New York publishers Henry Holt and Company. As both Yost and Reedy continued to promote the book, the mystery of Patience Worth only continued to grow, reaching new audiences and asking new questions. This time, her story reached the eyes and ears of the scientific crowd, where psychologists began looking at the case. Primary among these was Dr. Morton Prince, a Boston-based specialist in personality dissociation and the founder and editor of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. Prince contacted Pearl and arranged a meeting in Boston during an upcoming tour to New York, where the Currans, alongside Casper Yost, planned to hold a series of public Ouija board demonstrations in what essentially amounted to a book tour promoting Yost's Patience Worth: A Psychic Mystery. Pearl met with Prince on the 14th of November 1915 in his home in Boston. Prior to leaving on the tour, Pearl had asked Patience if she would be fine to travel and still be able to communicate with Pearl far from their St. Louis home, to which Patience replied in the affirmative, so Pearl had no concerns on that front. On the other hand, if Pearl had found Reedy and his critic friends had been sceptical and tough questioners, she was set for a rude awakening in the meeting with Prince. The sessions started politely enough. Prince questioned Patience and she answered in her usual tone. But when Prince began digging into Patience's past, his obvious frustration at her inability to answer simple yes or no questions became glaringly apparent. With the first session ending in something of a whimper, the pair planned to meet several days later for a second crack. This time, Prince came from a different angle, carrying out a series of experiments, asking Patience if she could feel anything when he touched Pearl's arm with his hand. He also asked her how she could see and hear him if he was talking to Pearl. Unfortunately, Patience was not in the mood for giving any answers, and when Prince returned to digging up her past, all he uncovered was that Patience had been alive in the time of Cromwell and that her mother's name had been Anne and her father John. When he questioned her on the name of the ship that she had sailed aboard to America, Patience once more resorted to vague responses that omitted any solid answers or factual details. At the end of the session, Price was utterly angered by the whole affair and suggested to Pearl that she would undertake a session with him where he could question Pearl and Patience under hypnosis. This Pearl refused, saying that she was too concerned that such an act might permanently damage her ability to communicate with Patience. In the end, Prince left the session with as much scepticism as he had entered with. Unfortunately, he was quite happy to share these thoughts with the press, especially after Pearl shared the story of the meeting with the papers in an effort to drum up a bit of buzz for her meetings in New York. Angered that these private meetings had been leaked in such a manner, Prince struck back, telling the papers that he had found nothing of scientific importance or interest when meeting with Pearl, and that he had considered the results inconsequential and of no scientific value whatever. This was far from the perfect start to a book tour that they had hoped, but fortunately the publishers in New York, Henry Holt and Company, were far less sceptical. Or, at least, they were far more interested in the commercial prospects of Patience's story. Whilst in a meeting where they would thrash out the details of Yost's upcoming book, Pearl contacted Patience and had the spirit describe the front cover illustration that she would like, as well as the colour of the bindings. Thoroughly on board with the project, Henry Holt set the publication date for February of 1916, and when it did finally publish, the book sold through the first print run almost instantly and was quickly sent for a second printing. This was in no small part thanks to Reedy and Yost's continued articles on the story. It was also helped well on its way by the positively glowing review from the New York Times, which described Patience's writings as genius through a Ouija board, concluding that the immense mass of communications, their high level of literary quality, their flashes of genius, the distinct and interesting personality revealed, arrest attention and set the whole affair immeasurably beyond any other communication which has ever pretended to come from the other side of the grave. Having already hooked the interest of the literary and now the scientific world, the successful publication of Yost's book moved on to a new audience, opening up the case to the psychical community, who, stumbling upon the backstory from Yost, were keen to investigate for themselves. James Hislop, the director and one of the founding members of the predecessor of what would be the American Society for Psychical Research, read and reviewed Yost's book in the Society's 1916 journal. Unlike the general public, who had been generally enamoured with the story, Hislop slammed it for a case that he believed would not stand a moment's scientific scrutiny. Quite opposite from the New York Times, he found little to be interested in Yost's new book, and he gave it short shrift. We are asked to swallow, without hesitation, the superficial statements and beliefs of a newspaper editor who boasts his ignorance of psychic research and of a publisher who desires to sell his wares. Unsurprisingly, given the sheer number of literary academics that had signed up wholesale to Patience's writings from Reader's Mirror, Hislop's review caused an outcry in the circle of believers who had staked their reputation on everything that they had read in the papers, which kicked off a feud that would last all summer. Letters were written and published back and forth on the veracity of Patience Worth, with no end in sight. Meanwhile, back at the Ouija board, Patience continued to churn out her writings, including the beginnings of what would go on to be her third full-length work, this time focusing on the life of a child born at the time of Jesus Christ, who would go on to be crucified alongside the Christian Messiah. Just as things got started, however, a new line of discussion began slipping through from Patience, who started to suggest that Pearl and John adopt a child. If this sounds strange, then things only continued to spiral after Patience described in quite definite terms what the child should look like, including gender and hair colour. Patience also decided that they should name this child after her and that she would take over much of the parental responsibilities, including dictating how it should be dressed. For anything that needed doing in the physical realm, the responsibilities, Patience commanded, should be shared amongst all of Pearl's closest inner circle of Patience Worth believers. Unsurprisingly, when a baby was discovered that seemed to match exactly the description that Patience had requested, many of the followers believed that the child was, in fact, a reincarnation of Patience herself. All the while that the Patience Worth inner circle had been morphing into something of a cult-like following, Patience continued to write through Pearl. Only now, another new development had occurred, whereby Pearl had started channeling Patience's words directly to paper, rather than through the Ouija board. Perhaps it was sheer luck, but this new process certainly helped to speed up the work of Patience's latest novel, which was now nearing completion. Titled A Sorry Tale, Pearl and Casper Yost took the work to their New York publishers once more, who were more than happy to cash in on Patience's ever-growing fame. When the book was published in June of 1917, it was once again met with strong positivity from the critics. The New York Times proved just as charitable with their reviewers as they had with the previous work. The long and intricate tale is constructed with the precision and the accuracy of a master hand. It is a wonderful, a beautiful and a noble book, but it is not easy to read. Its archaic language and its frequently indirect modes of expression make necessary constantly the closest attention. The meaning is often so obscure that only considerable study will make it clear. Whoever would read it through will need to be well supplied with time and patience. But if he appreciates the noble and the beautiful in literature, he will be well repaid, and he will marvel more deeply than ever over the mystery of Patience Worth. Whilst the reviews were just as impressive as Yost's book on Patience, the release of A Sorry Tale had presented a new challenge for Pearl. Whilst Yost's work had been met with resounding commercial success, Patience's latest book was nothing more than a novel, with no spiritualist mystery to bolster the writing. In that sense, it laid Patience's writing bare, and it was, perhaps, that reason that would set the mystery of Patience Worth on a decline that she would never quite manage to recover from. With the publication of A Sorry Tale, the large audience fostered by the intrigue behind the Patience Worth mystery, highlighted in Yost's book, had their first chance to read a full-length work by the enigmatic spirit author. Unfortunately for Pearl Curran, this included several historians and scholars who were quick to pick up on the many historical inaccuracies in Patience's speech, and they were not in the mood to be kind, with one commenting that it closely resembled gibberish. This didn't have much of an effect on Pearl, who continued to communicate with Patience, and it didn't really seem to have much effect on Patience either, who, over the following 2 years, continued to pump out verse after verse, completing another 2 full-length works. It did, however, affect Patience's following and the publisher's willingness to continue releasing her work. Casper Yost continued to pump articles on the goings-on, and Pearl's husband, John, attempted to start his own publishing house, which would release a monthly magazine full of Patience's writings. The magazine sold for 15 cents a copy and offered a subscription, with John Curran working hard to secure advertising partners to keep it afloat, but it never really managed to break even, and after 10 months, it completely folded, leaving the Curran's bank balance $4,000 lighter. Meanwhile, Patience completed her latest epic, a 90,000-word novel named Hope Trueblood, which ran for 363 pages. Henry Holt did agree to publish it, but it never really reached the commercial heights of Patience's earlier work, despite being nominated as an outstanding author for 1918 by the Joint Committee of Literary Arts in New York. The Los Angeles Times called it a masterpiece in their review of the book. But, as with every new release, praise came hand in hand with criticism, and this time the book was picked up by Agnes Repplier, a writer and critic for the Atlantic Monthly, a literary and cultural magazine based in Boston. The piece that Agnes wrote was called Dead Authors, and it didn't entirely focus on Patience Worth exclusively, with Agnes criticising the rise in spiritualism and the subsequent growth in works that had been published by supposed automatic writing. When she did focus on Patience Worth specifically, she absolutely savaged her works. She called the Currans out for perpetrating a hoax, and using Patience's own words against her, she scathingly dug out her published books. Ghosts there have always been since men began to die. They have played their part in disquieting the world since the world awoke to trouble. Vengeful, prophetic, fantastic, and invariably de trop, they have come down to us through the centuries, discredited but feared. Now, our old apprehensions, our old creeps and shivers are exchanged for new and reasonable misgivings. Spirits soothing as syrup, didactic as dominies, prolific and platitudinous, are dictating books for the world's betterment, and never a word which can add to our store of knowledge, or stand the dry north light of intellect. We are told that once, when Patience Worth was spelling out the endless pages of the sorry tale, she came to a sudden stop, then wrote, "This be enough," and knocked off for the night. A blessed phrase, and of a certainty her finest inspiration. Would that all dead authors would adopt it as their motto, and with Ouija boards and table legs and automatic pencils write as their farewell message to the world those 3 short, comely words, "This be enough." Agnes concluded this article, citing Casper Yost himself. "The larger literature is to come," says Mr. Yost ominously, "and we fear that he speaks the truth." This was a rather ungracious nail in the coffin of Patience Worth, whose book sales had floundered. Sensing a commercial flop, even Yost's newest work on Patience, which was to be a collection of poetry, was turned down by the New York publishers. And worse, Pearl Curran had begun seeking to publish her own stories. This was a development that rubbed many people the wrong way, since the Currans, Yost and Reedy had always sold the public on Patience's viability, with the understanding that Pearl had no talent for writing whatsoever. Indeed, for the most part, they had made out that Pearl could barely put together a letter. And now, here she was, looking to publish a romantic fiction in one national magazine. By 1920, the public interest had waned significantly, and Pearl found herself surrounded by only the most loyal and long-serving followers of Patience. Pearl published an essay titled "A Nut for Psychologists," wherein she described her distrust of psychologists and psychical investigators, whilst also admitting that she, like all psychics, had invited suspicion onto herself by making the case of Patience Worth public. She also, rather interestingly, detailed the process she went through to pen Patience's words, describing them much like she was simply watching a movie unfold before her eyes, whilst Patience narrated whatever she was seeing. "I am like a child with a magic picture book. Once I look upon it, all I have to do is watch its pages open before me and revel in their beauty and variety and novelty. When the poems come, there also appear before my eyes images of each successive symbol as the words are given to me. If the stars are mentioned, I see them in the sky. If heights or deeps or wide spaces are mentioned, I get positively frightening sweeps of space. So it is with the smaller things of nature, the fields, the flowers and the trees, with the field animals, whether they are mentioned in the poem or not." This piece was an enlightening and fascinating look into the mystery of Patience, But it was also a quite enlightening look into the abilities of Pearl Curran, who, as mentioned before, said that she could not actually write anything. It was also, sadly, all too little too late. By July of 1920, William Reedy, one of Patience's longest and most well-connected backers, had passed away, effectively cutting off one of Pearl's best publicists. At the same time, John Curran also fell ill and was hospitalised, leading to Pearl gradually winding down her public séance sessions for 2 years, until John died on the 1st of June 1922. Obviously, the death of her husband was a tough blow for Pearl, but it struck Patience hard too, as John had, for several years, been keeping meticulous records of all of her writings. In most cases, Pearl was able to find someone to substitute in for the now empty role, but there was never a complete record again. Slowly but surely, Pearl and Patience were sliding quietly into obscurity, their 15 minutes of fame well and truly over. Nevertheless, Pearl continued to communicate with Patience and was remarried soon after her husband's death, though she did divorce again 2 years later. In 1931, she married for the third time, this time to a man that she had originally been engaged to when she was just 19. Rekindling their lost love, the couple moved to Los Angeles, where they raised 3 children, including Patience Jr., who was by now a lively young girl, with little idea of her undead foster mother. Unfortunately, nor did this marriage last too long either, and Pearl found herself divorced after just a couple of years. On Thanksgiving evening, the 25th of November, 1937, Patience delivered her final communication. My heart overflows. I am exalted. I am thy child, and thou hast graced me. Take thou my labour, O gracious God, as but thy grace reflected, and know thy Son glories in that reflection. Accept then the Alleluia my soul proclaims before the wonder. A week later, on the 3rd of December 1937, Pearl Curran passed away after a short bout of pneumonia. Having largely disappeared from the public eye, Pearl's death sparked new interest from psychical investigators, and especially the American Society of Psychical Research, who, after scorning Pearl and Patience so harshly many years earlier, now wrote an article calling her case one of the most tantalising in the history of psychical research. When all was said and done, the questions always remained. Who was Patience Worth? Was she really a spirit speaking from the other side? Was she an alternative personality of Pearl's, or was she simply a hoax? If she really was a spirit, then there was every chance that she should have existed in records somewhere, especially thanks to her immigration to America. Unfortunately, no records of Patience Worth have ever been discovered. Whilst on her book tour to New York, Pearl and John did endeavour to seek out the actual burial site of Patience, which had been described to them in some detail, though ultimately nothing was ever discovered. One of the strongest insistences from Pearl's camp in support of the spirits theory was that Pearl had never really been much of a writer herself. In her youth, she had never really been a big reader either, and throughout the years that she communicated with Patience, she claimed several times to have tried to read poetry and literature only to have given up due to boredom or lack of understanding. Dr. Prince, the highly sceptical psychologist who spent 2 sessions communicating with Patience through Pearl, strongly believed that Patience was an alternate personality of Pearl's, and he thought that Pearl had been suffering from what is now known as dissociative personality disorder, though thanks to Pearl's suspicions of scientists and hypnosis, he was never able to confirm his theory through further investigation. Or was it all just a scam and a hoax on behalf of the Currans? There is little doubt that Casper Yost and William Reedy made a good deal of money through their papers by keeping the Patience case in the public eye, but the Currans themselves didn't seem to profit financially at all. They sold a few books, and they definitely received donations and gifts from their ardent followers, especially when the baby Patience came on the scene, but they had also lost a significant amount of money through the publication of the unprofitable Patience Worth monthly magazine. Perhaps Pearl had simply been a bored housewife, with fading dreams of fame and fortune, who had decided to grab life by the reins and bring a fresh spark back into her life. Whatever the truth was, the answer will remain as vague and cryptic as any given by Patience when she was in full swing. In total, the spirit had written 7 full-length works, hundreds of poems, and dozens of shorter works, totaling several millions of words. Unfortunately, none of them were ever concrete enough to secure her place in reality. And so, 90 years after her final message, we are left with the same old questions asked by thousands of people back when she was at the peak of her fame. Who and what was Patience Worth? So that was the story of Patience Worth, and there's definitely quite a bit to speak about after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So, Patience Worth. Now, this is a story, and there's a lot to get into here, I guess. Now, I think you can probably guess that I'm relatively sceptical about this. I absolutely loved Agnes Repellier, I think her name was, the critic, who absolutely tore into them. I thought her writing was hilarious. This Be Nuff was a very scathing critique. But yes, so as you can imagine, I'm quite sceptical, and I'm sure you are also fairly sceptical. My skepticism stems from, well, several things really, but it starts with Patience Worth, right? We'll start with Patience Worth. She was just a belligerent sort of, well, pain in the butt, really. And whenever anyone asked her any sort of questions that required factual answers that she really should have known, they were always, every time, without fail, deflected. Or at very best, they were given vague non-answers, almost like politician answers. They were also quite frequently chucked in insults or knockdowns whenever anyone was asking too many difficult questions. She got quite short and shirty with them, which, they would took to mean, you better not annoy Patience anymore because, she might get angry with you or whatever. And obviously, who wants to anger an unseen spirit? Nobody. So everyone shut up, right? So, that I think is quite a damning element to the story, the fact that she was just not willing to answer sometimes quite simple questions, which are all available to read, amazingly, because aside from the sources that I posted in the show notes, there's also the entire record of that John Curran had kept of Patience's transcripts, and you can literally read over tons of her writing. I'm not sure why you'd want to, because it's frustrating as all hell to read, which I suppose we could sort of move on to that. I guess the fact that she sort of spoke in this weird archaic dialect, which was supposedly Old English, but as an English person myself, and you don't even need to be an English person, but anyone I think with any sort of grasp on interest in British history will know that the dialects in England were numerous. I mean, they still are even today, but they were numerous, and you didn't have to go far before one dialect became almost unintelligible to the next. You had towns quite close to one another speaking in quite different dialects, and yet Pearl seemed to sort of speak in a dialect that no one could quite pin down. She sort of said it was like this amalgamated language, but I don't really buy that. I think it was just someone basically sort of cosplaying an English 17th century peasant. I think that's what it comes down to. There are other things that, nail that on for me. The fact that, she would never quite give any solid details about where in England she was from. She said she was from Dorsetshire, which didn't exist. For a start, it's Dorset. And on top of that, she would describe places which could be anywhere in England. She would describe places that you could shoehorn in 30 minutes from my house. I could find landscapes that looked exactly like she described. And yet I live 300 miles from where she said that she lived. So, it really was that vague that you could just fit him into any part of the English countryside you like, really. That one of her followers, I think it was Yost actually, went to England, and he was all really excited because he was like, I found all these landmarks just like she sort of said they were. They're exactly in the places that she said they would be. But of course, all these things were just the English countryside. And of course, he would have seen them anywhere he went. So I didn't really buy that either. I think, none of her sort of speech or anything she says really sold it to me. So why? What was it? What do I think it was, at least? That's I think an interesting question, and I think it's sort of multifaceted. Actually, I think we look at Pearl. Now, she was like someone who grew up wanting like to be a singer and theatrical, and she played the piano, and she wanted to do music in life. And then, like so many women of that era, she got married, and then all those dreams just have to be discarded because now you're a wife, and that's your main role in life. That's what you have to do. Everything else gets like forgotten about, essentially. And in a sense, that's a big part of you is therefore discarded, and you now have to be someone very different. That's maybe not someone you want to be, but that's all part of being a wife at the time. And that was a big part of why spiritualism blew up anyway, because you had all these essentially bored housewives that had no agency in life. They had like nothing really that they felt they could do, and no sort of power either to do anything. And so suddenly spiritualism gave all these people basically a new interest, a new hobby, a new reason to get out of bed in the morning that wasn't, housework and essentially catering to their husbands. So, you see that reflected in Pearl, I think, very deeply. She was always a curious, quite intellectual child, clearly. She was very intelligent. She wanted this like kind of theatrical life, and you could see it when she got bored at home as well, and she moved to Chicago to take singing lessons. She wanted more from life, and then she married into essentially a dull situation, and so she, I think, created more for herself. I personally think it was just her sort of indulging a new interest or a new hobby, something like that. Some people have said that she was, maybe dissociative personality disorder. So that the psychologists believed that at the time, and I think that's an interesting path to walk down. But I just don't think you need to be diagnosing people like that when there's simpler answers, and that's that it was a bit of a hoax. And I think where that then continues is that Yost wrote the papers, made a lot of money from selling the story. He certainly kept it in the paper for a long time because it was selling papers. And then he wrote the book and, made money from that. So he had every reason to keep that alive, right, as a publicist. On top of this, you then had Reedy, who was also a huge publicist. He was a key figure to have on board, right? He was a well-known critic, a well-respected critic, and he was key to have on board, because I think what he provided to the situation was almost like an emperor's new clothes kind of thing. Like I forget the name of the story, but the emperor or the king that wears like invisible clothes, no clothes, and everyone says, "Oh yeah, it's great because he's the king, and you can't go against the king," right? And this, I think, is similar to this. Like, I've got a feeling like Reedy bigged it up and said that it was genius. And then you had all these other intellectuals and academics that then couldn't turn around and say, well, actually, I think this is rubbish, because this like great critic had said that it was great. Therefore, everyone had to say it was great. And if you look at Patience's works, I think it actually backs this up, because it's so pretentious, so floral and so archaic, and it means nothing like quite frequently, but it sounds like it should mean something. And I think you had all these academics and intellectuals that were essentially reading this stuff and not quite grasping it, because there's nothing to grasp. And because there's nothing to grasp, suddenly they felt, well, if I admit that, people are going to think I'm stupid. I think that was a huge part of the popularity of her writing, is that it made people feel like they were intelligent by, reading it. And you had all these intellectuals which needed to feel like they could understand it, something like that. I think this is something like I feel like this all sort of plays into like the hoax of Patience Worth. Whether or not they did that intentionally and to profit is another question. Like, was Reedy actually in on it with Yost? Was Reedy saying, look, hey, I'll big it up and everyone will buy it and we'll split the proceeds of the published books, or were they just separately sort of knowing what made good copy? Because the other simple answer as well is that Reedy and Yost were both selling magazines and newspapers, and they both were selling, the story of Pearl Curran, and it's proof positive that the mystery of Patience Worth was more interesting than her works, because the very first book sold the best, and the very first book was the one that told about the mystery. When we got to Patience's just raw works, the sales sort of began to decline until they eventually fell off a cliff entirely. So, it's proof positive that the more interesting aspect of the case was the mystery of it all, and like, who was Patience Worth. And Yost and Reedy were both writing articles about that very subject weekly and selling, pushing magazines and newspapers. So were they sort of in on it? Was it all a big scam and a big hoax, or was it all just really like, say, like a bored housewife who wanted to sort of regain a bit of agency in her life, and two publicists who wanted to profit from that? I think that's possibly the case. Things maybe blew up a little and got a bit out of hand, and here we are. But a great story nonetheless. And, maybe, just maybe, it was real. There are one or two things that are interesting. Like, there's the psychic areas where she sort of showed herself to be a little bit kind of like psychic, supposedly. There are some things like Patience Worth. There's never been any records found of Patience Worth that can nail down a particular Patience Worth, but Patience Worth did exist, and there was Worth was a popular family name at the time, and there was several Patience Worths, and there was one that moved to America as well, but different. They moved to a different place than what Patience said she moved to, so it doesn't really match up. But it's tantalizing, right? Things like this kind of seed a tiny bit of doubt, maybe. I mean, for me, I would say I'm fairly skeptical on this case, but there are things there that, can sort of suck you in if you find it interesting. But I think lastly, just the last thing to say really is that I think Pearl Curran was like clearly an excellent speaker. And if nothing else, she was quite an incredible person just for being able to improvise, thousands of words at a time and keep in character as well. It may have been a character which wasn't historically accurate or whatever, you can have those criticisms, but she still kept in character. And that's quite amazing, really. I think if this is all a hoax, which I kind of expect it to be, I think she kept it going incredibly well and was clearly a really creative, intelligent person to be able to do that. Unlike some people, when they hoax these things, they don't sort of find the need to sort of think that she's a bad person or anything like that. I sort of criticize her for those things. I think, like I say, I think it was started fairly innocently, and I think it, was only perpetuated through really her own kind of abilities as a speaker and a creative writer. So yeah, I don't know what you think. I've got a feeling that most people will feel fairly skeptical about this story, but we'll see. If you do want to get in touch and tell me I'm wrong and whatever, you can do so. My email is contact@darkhistories.com. There's also plenty of ways you can contact me on social media and stuff. All of those links are in the show notes, as well as on the website, which is darkhistories.com. If you go there, you can find links to just everything you need, ways of contacting me. There's also ways that you can support, like buying merch, the books, or the Patreon. I do have a Patreon, and that any sort of help in that way is obviously greatly received. But don't at all feel obligated. It's free podcast for everyone. Thanks very much for listening. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this week's story. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another story. We'll have a Yesterday Today next week, of course, but 2 weeks for another full-length episode. So until then, thank you very much for listening. Take care. Sleep tight.